Great. Welcome everyone to the first of 4 sessions of our in conversation webinars on conservation's leading edges. This session is on transforming conservation practice through indigenous-led monitoring and evaluation. And we have 3 fantastic speakers with us here, Rachel Dax, Janelle Baker, and Yolanda Lopez. And I would like to not waste any time and just hand over to our speakers. So Rachel, take it away. You can introduce yourself, Rachel.
Can you see my first slide?
Yeah, we can see it well, thanks.
Excellent, great. Well, aloha mai kako from the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. My name is Rachel Dax. I grew up in Miami, Florida, and have resided in a couple of different Pacific islands for several years now. I'm currently an assistant professor in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm excited to share with you all today on biocultural approaches and indicators for conservation. And I really look forward to the discussion part of this because I'd love to hear your questions. And I'm going to give you some kind of a bit of an academic background, but then some practical, how this looks on the ground. And I'll end with some questions that are kind of lingering and that I continue to ask myself and continue to ask others as I do some advising on with groups who do this type of work. So really looking forward to discussing that further. And so many conservation projects, as many of you know, because you're probably involved in them, they're guided by this ecosystem services framework, aiming to maintain or restore species and ecosystems that support human well-being, that by definition. And those goods and services might be things like biodiversity, they might be provisioning services like water or climate regulation. And one of the categories of ecosystem services is this CES, this cultural ecosystem services category. But the impact or success of conservation is not often measured in terms of the maintenance or enhancement of cultural ecosystem services. And cultural ecosystem services, or I'll refer to them as CES, the definition of them are the many kind of unseen, sometimes the word intangible or immaterial are used. There are all these ways that the environment contributes to human well-being through things like connections to place, connections to people in these places, spirituality, inspiration, and others. And when cultural ecosystem services are usually included in the planning or the monitoring and evaluation parts of conservation projects, many times the CES that are assessed are these pretty broad categories such as recreation, number of visitors, things like this, income from visitors to the area, things like that, that are easy to measure, but they're not necessarily meaningful to Indigenous peoples and local communities. So that being said, in recent years, there has been great progress made in localizing cultural ecosystem services by folks such as Puala Pascua and others. And so ecosystem service frameworks have also been criticized in their depiction of this one-way flow of these so-called benefits from nature to people. And many communities perceive their relationships with places, the land and landscapes and seascapes that they are a part of. They don't see these as a flow of benefits, but they see these as relationships that are reciprocal in nature, and they don't necessarily identify themselves as stakeholders or users that receive benefits. Many people in place-based communities also consider themselves as contributors to what Converti et al. Call services to ecosystems. And so we can think about relational values and use biocultural approaches to understand these flows that go in both directions. And this is probably of review for many of you, but just to get us grounded in the same place. And I just said it, I said biocultural, and it was in my title slide. And I know this is a word that's somewhat kind of exploded and overused in recent years. And what does it actually mean, or how am I going to use it? Well, if we just look back to the last 20 plus years, we see that it's been used in with a lot of different kind of partner words, right? Um, and it's used along things like diversity, which is kind of one of its original uses, biocultural diversity, and you'll see later heritage, approaches, conservation, etc. But if we go back to kind of that original biocultural diversity term, the biocultural movement is actually said to have a couple of different origin stories. And one of these origin stories came about in the 1990s or so, as people were mapping these biodiversity hotspots, and linguistics and other measures of culture were being overlaid onto these hotspot maps, and correlations became apparent. So where there were high levels of biodiversity, there were also high levels of measures of culture, such as language. And this pointed to the inextricable links between biodiversity and culture, but it also pointed to the fact that where there are areas of high biodiversity, these are places where indigenous peoples and local communities have been stewarding for centuries, if not millennia in some places. And so at its core, biocultural refers to the links and feedbacks and relationships between environment or biodiversity, language, and culture knowledge that have co-evolved over time and support communities in the sustainable management of their resources over time and into the future as well. And so another kind of term that biocultural is used with is approaches. And Michael Gavin and his team define biocultural approaches to conservation as conservation actions made in the service of sustaining the biophysical and sociocultural components of dynamic, interacting, and interdependent social ecological systems. Other scholars who I've had the privilege of working with point out that biocultural approaches seek to maintain or restore connections and feedbacks between people and place. Biocultural approaches are based on indigenous people and local communities' own understandings of their well-being and how it's supported by the relationship to nature. And then biocultural approaches to conservation have goals and indicators that are focused on processes, not just the outcomes. And so just to kind of give you an example of what a biocultural approach looks like in real life. So I'm going to go through some work that I've been a part of with a team of folks from across the Pacific Islands to develop biocultural indicators. And to do this, we've used participatory methods to understand what well-being mean, like what does it look like? What does that concept actually mean to local communities across the Pacific? And I've done a little bit of work outside of the Pacific as well, but mostly in this region. And so first off, acknowledging that even in English, we don't have like a single definition for well-being. If we look across different fields and communities and disciplines, there's all different definitions for well-being, right? So a good place to start to develop biocultural indicators is really to first understand what does well-being mean to specific local communities? Is there a word? Is there a story? And in Hawaii, a concept that is associated with well-being is something called aina mamona, which literally translates to fatty lands, but it's really a concept that conjures up images of abundance that support communities. And so we can use these concepts to ask questions in order to understand not just what is the concept or word associated with well-being, but what does that look like in real life, right? And so here are some example prompting questions that we've asked communities to understand what well-being looks like to communities. And so in Hawaii, for example, we asked, what does aina mamona, so that local concept name, what does it look like for you? And all these questions have been translated, right? So they were asked in local languages. Another question we've asked is, what is your community known for? What do you want your community to be known for? What are you most proud of in your community? If an ancestor from long ago returned to your community, what would they think was better? What would they miss, right? And so we've asked these questions across the region and heard a lot of responses. Some examples of those responses we've heard are things like places with high levels of well-being are places that are famous for particular resources that still provide those resources. places with high levels of well-being are places in which people maintain strong relationships with their amakua, that's in Hawaii, so those are guardian species. Other places they have totem species or other culturally important species. Across the region, we've heard really strongly that places with high levels of well-being have an impulse to hui with a purpose or really work together for a shared goal or vision. In Fiji, this is known as Solosolobaki. In the Marshall Islands, Lalitron. Places that have high levels of well-being have access to land and planting materials, access to fishing grounds, and sometimes we've heard things that we would hear, similarly in urban settings that aren't necessarily place-based communities, like access to healthcare is being important. And so we've compiled, so in these workshops, we oftentimes have participants organize the responses themselves. When we've done these across the Pacific, we did some kind of meta organizing and came up with these 8 dimensions, which are not standalone, and there's lots of interaction. They are not mutually exclusive. But under each of these dimensions, I put a paper in the I listed a paper on this slide and we can share that. But each of these dimensions has a number of factors under them. So for example, connectedness to people and place, that dimension has all these factors which were created as a result of these responses in the workshops. And in this paper, which I mentioned, we actually developed several examples of indicators for these 2 dimensions because there are very few examples in these kind of large international indicator sets that are often used to measure the impacts of conservation or well-being in communities. And so here's an example of an indicator that could be used as that would fall in the dimension of connectedness to people and place. The kind of factor would be connections within and between communities. And this is related to conservation or resource management because connections either within or between communities may exist because of sharing or exchange of specific natural resources that should be accounted for if there are restrictions on species or area. And so an indicator that could measure this factor could be something like what is the level of cohesion of networks both inside and outside the community, and what's the level of exchange of whatever specific resource or species. And this is an indicator that we have used and measured in Fiji, for example. So in this paper, we give several other examples of indicators, and I just really want to point out that they're not all based on practices. Some of these indicators are based on knowledge or people's perception. And some questions that come up often or that I really like to stress to people who are doing this kind of work, I just want to list them out. So and there are some resources that we'll share that that go through working through some of these questions. But first off, who will be involved in developing these indicators in the community if this is indigenous-led monitoring and evaluation? Is everyone's voice going to be heard? Are all viewpoints and ways of knowing represented, knowing that communities are not homogenous, right? And different people have different knowledges and perceptions and skills. And then who's distilling the information from these participatory sessions? Do they have the proper lenses to interpret the data? Who will be measuring, monitoring, or assessing the indicators? And so I know this is an Indigenous-led session, and if Indigenous peoples or communities are developing these indicators and are expected to monitor, but if they're reporting to an outside agency or an outside funder, it's important to know if it's appropriate, whether communities are being appropriately compensated for this work, because it takes a lot of time, right? And there are issues, for example, in Hawaii, where communities are expected to do this monitoring and report it to the government. But if the government does it, the government folks are compensated for it, right? And so making sure that the compensation exists. And then similarly or related, I guess, who is the resulting data for? And how will the data be used? Is it for communities? Is it for government? Is it for external funders? And if it is for communities, does actual quantitative data actually need to be collected? Or is this monitoring already done informally without necessarily quantitative collected data? And if it is already being done, I would really want to think really carefully about how those processes for monitoring, if they're already being done, are those good enough? Like, can those just be what is important, and can those be maybe used in more formal ways? Because I would really want to be careful for not disrupting those traditional monitoring processes that may already be occurring. Another thing to think about when we're thinking about data and who is it for, if it's going to be shared outside the village, is it okay to share in its form that it's collected, or does it need to be aggregated, or who do permissions need to be sought in order to be able to share it? Is it too sensitive to share? Those types of questions. And then a question that I get a lot from people outside of communities, more like funders and government agencies, but they ask, how can these indicators be standardized for cross-site comparison? And I would just ask to think carefully about what can be standardized and what loses its meaning when it's standardized, if that's the goal there. And can we just have categories per se, and communities choose their, so the categories would be standardized, and maybe communities can choose indicators within the categories that resonate for themselves. So these are just lots of questions to consider. And I think I'm probably up for time, but I look forward to chatting with you all more. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So I think we're just going to move into Janelle's presentation. Everyone, please write down your questions and save them for later, because we'll start the dialogue after we've heard from the three speakers. Thank you so much again, Rachel. And here is Janelle Baker. Please introduce yourself and launch in.
So I'm Janelle Baker. I'm in anthropology at Athabasca University, which is in what is now known as Northern Alberta, in what is now known as Canada. And so I'm going to talk a bit today about sort of the history of how I came to do work with communities, collaborative work on community-based monitoring. I'm going to sort of broadly describe a couple projects, and then, give some thoughts on kind of the tangled mess that is community-based monitoring where I work. And the first example that I'm going to use is where I work in Northern Alberta, which is the area that is infamous for having oil sands mining. And so this is like a highly political, sort of contentious context that we're working in there. I ended up coming to this work after doing a master's in anthropology on ethnobotany in Northwest Mexico. And it just happened to be, it was 2005, and there happened to be a major court case in Canada in the Treaty 8 region, which encompasses what is now known as Northern Alberta. So this court case established really clearly the duty that the federal Canadian government has to consult Indigenous people, First Nations, regarding effects of proposed developments on their treaty rights or their inherent rights that are protected by treaty off reserve. So you might be familiar with the fact that many First Nations people in Canada live on reserves, but their traditional territory is much larger. And when this coincides with Crown or public lands, they have rights to hunt, fish, trap, practice ceremony, collect plants, that sort of thing, their broad life ways in those areas. And so this court case happened, and suddenly there was all of this need for the federal government, who passed the duty to the provincial government, who passes the duty to industrial project proponents, to consult First Nations and have them kind of assess the project area and predict the effects that the project will have on their livelihoods. and so that it kind of becomes part of an environmental impact assessment. So I ended up working in that world for 6 to 8 years in between my master's and PhD, and that really informed my doctoral work. So I was really interested in, again, ethnobotany, ethnobiology, anthropology, and but inevitably working in that realm brought these sort of environmental monitoring and food sovereignty and land right concerns to the forefront. I can't really look at those things and be on the land with elders without hearing a long list of their observations of change and concerns about the environment. So yeah, then I did my doctoral work in partnership with Fort McKay First Nation and Big Stone Cree, mostly doing projects where I was interested in their cultural experiences and perceptions with contamination of their bush food supply, because those are concerns I was hearing from the communities that I didn't think were being represented in this consultation interface. And right at that time, I'm gonna just change up my slides, because at that time, I was seeking permission from Chief and Council and from the community to continue with this research. And people were bringing in ducks covered in oil and deformed fish, like from the community. So you can see the fish with lesions and a deformed face and ducks with oil. Here's a beaver house and waterway that's been had an oil spill. And these are kind of what we might call, I hate to use the word small, but they're what we might call more of a small scale, things that aren't reported, publicly or in the news or well monitored. So community members are observing these sorts of incidents all the time, and they don't have trust with the system. Even still, community members are like, we don't trust taking this to the government or the company. Where can we do our own testing? And so even in my doctoral work, we ended up applying for a grant where we tested food for contaminants, volatile organic compounds, heavy metals. Now we do a lot of work on glyphosate as well, because the logging companies are spraying glyphosate all across the boreal forest, and people are really concerned about it. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself. And this work is actually starting to come up in court cases. I guess I'll talk about that in a moment. But so this is on a map, the region that I already mentioned. The star is kind of the general area. And then if you see what would be central Alberta, north of that, we have Fort McMurray, which is infamous for the oil sands. And this is Big Stone Cree territory. This is just a map of the oil sands deposits. There's actually 3 of them, or what you might call bitumen deposits. So you can see the surface mineable area is along the Athabasca River, and the rest of the area, there's other drilling technologies used that we hear less about in the media. And if anyone wants to, just for the sake of time, I'll move on. But if anyone wants to chat about that later, we can. This is a map that Big Stone Cree Nation created several years ago now, showing the human footprint, the physical effects. So we think of the boreal forest as just being kind of wild bush, but you can see that there's seismic and oil and gas and bitumen and logging throughout the boreal forests. And more dramatically, when I was talking about the Athabasca River and the mining, inevitably, if you have the mining of bitumen, you have really large tailings ponds and upgraders there, because it's a very energy, ironically, a very energy thirsty production to create bitumen. It takes a lot of energy input. So the monitoring that I ended up doing started with a berry monitoring project with Fort McKay First Nation, where we visited berry patches in the oil sands, like near oil sands mines that were traditional patches of the community. And this was a project that had been struggling for a while to get off the ground. It was in partnership with an air monitoring organization. And some of the people involved in the project wanted to start with these sort of ecologically similar places, and we're trying to force elders to pick places on the map. And I happened to be interested because I knew I wanted to do my doctoral work on this, and I was working with Fort McKay, and I said, hey, I'd love to help with this project. And I made the outrageous suggestion that we visit berry patches, which no one had actually thought about on the project. So I laugh because it seems so silly to me, but we really just spent the first year visiting berry patches that community members go to and are concerned about. And then then we added monitoring on top of that. So, and so when I think about this monitoring and the work that I did in traditional land use consulting, like it was really important to me all these years where elders were giving all this information for these assessments of projects that I was trying to help communities on, that I was hired to do, that I responded to the communities, that the elders that took me in the land and shared their time and knowledge with me. I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't just putting it in the reports that were being forgotten. It was a really frustrating part of that process. And so again, that's why I did the doctoral work, but then also like I continue, the projects that I have today are ones that community members ask for. So I've helped connect with microbiologists and toxicologists to help work on glyphosate monitoring because community members constantly ask me for that help. And I feel very privileged and fortunate to have that relationship where people can call me and say, hey, I need some help on the history of my trap line. Hey, there's been some kind of weird spill, like what can we do about it? And so I really think that once I got this position at a university, like it enables me to leverage my privilege and resources to support community projects. And to me, that's the best thing. And I was just saying it to a community member who called me yesterday, who is trying to track down historical documents about our family's trap line. And I was like, oh, I can actually use my connections here. Like, this is like, actually useful. And I really appreciate that, being able to do that. And so, I did write about this idea of research as reciprocity. So instead of being extractive with knowledge for all of these projects, I really wanted to reciprocate and honor that knowledge that had been shared with me. But ultimately, I question this idea of environmental monitoring a lot. So there's all these projects that like funding, especially in the oil sands context, for community-based monitoring. But what are we monitoring, and what techniques are we using? Because again, I think we're monitoring environmental damage mostly, right? Like we're recording damage that is happening as opposed to healthy systems, right? And also, haven't communities, like if we think about the terms, always been doing environmental monitoring? My understanding of being on the land and when elders on the land, they're constantly in communication with, the more than human species that communicate with them, their wellness, and, what the season's going to be doing, whether or not it's going to be a really cold winter. Like there's all of these ways that the environment communicates with humans about what is happening. And to me, that is environmental monitoring. Elders are already, or knowledge holders, or people who are on the land have already been doing environmental monitoring. And so, in a like a survival and life way kind of way. And so now what's happening though, is that they're saying, we see all these subtle and not so subtle indicators, like Rachel described, of ways that the environment is changing and telling us things are wrong. And so to me, that's where the environmental monitoring programs come in, and why communities, they're smart. They've been dealing with the politics of science for hire, of government negotiations for a long time now in this region. And so they know that if they also do the scientific work, that gives them more power in that negotiation process. But it takes a while. So all of these projects, the lab work is very expensive. And in order to actually publish and make claims, it takes a long time and a lot of work. And so it's frustrating when someone brings in a duck covered in oil, and that's not evidence enough for a community member that something is wrong. And so I live in this strange tension that I think we're going to speak about a lot today, about sort of community knowledge, it being enough. And then when we use science to prove or disprove what people are saying, or to support their projects or their claims, and, ways that we wield that power. But so I did work during my doctoral work with another doctoral student who did the toxicology work, for example. And so we do have publications that have come from this research. But again, for me, I'm a cultural anthropologist and ethnobiologist. So for me, it's about drinking tea and picking berries and spending time on the land with elders. That's where the joy is. There's a lot of things I don't write about. I don't write about a lot of medicinal plants or sensitive community information. I've been working more with this term of cultural keystone species, which was introduced by people working in the very communities I work in, again, as a framework, as a tool in the consultation interface. So again, I can talk more about that another time. And And so within the Big Stone context, we have a lot of little projects that all feed in to their environmental monitoring program now. And so I really quickly wanted to mention that I also work with Stoney Dakota Nations in the foothills in Alberta, which is actually where I grew up and reside. And we have a couple of different projects there where we're looking at an endangered species of fish and the stories. We call the project Restorying. So we're looking at how people talk about and relate to this fish. And have museum exhibits and school curriculum that we're creating to get kids thinking more about how things like ATV use affect the fish habitat, and how community members have these long-standing relationships with the fish as a food source. And that's grown into a project around coal mining and women testing for selenium while they're processing food, to kind of get ahead of proposed growth of coal mining in the eastern slopes of the Rockies. So my suggestions are coming from this work, and so I feel like to this crowd and this group of people, some of these are really obvious suggestions, but for me, when designing community-based monitoring projects, the Indigenous and local knowledge needs to always come first. So for me, a project is grounded in something community members come to me concerned about or talk about all the time. When you, like, if I ask them about berries, but then they're always talking about the dust on the berries. So to me, that's my responsibility if they are asking to help them design projects and find funds to look at those. But always, I think at the beginning and throughout projects, ask how science has been and can be used as a weapon against community land and food sovereignty. So if community members, like the example for me was when we're doing the berry project and we were connected to an environmental monitoring program that had direct funding and voting membership from the oil sands companies. So that those results that we had when we were monitoring air and berries, if they're any way implied that the berries are safe to eat, I knew that the organization and the companies were going to, you know, go to the news with that, you know, celebrate that the berries were safe. But, you know, to me, there were so many other factors about noise and access and whether or not communities felt safe eating those berries. There were many other factors that affect their access, you know, to their land rights. You know, and speaking of Canadian mines, is anyone in danger? You know, I'm very aware of someone who, you know, was raised in Canada and looks at mines here, that Canadian mines have a horrible reputation internationally. And we've been trying to help and support communities and community-based monitoring in some of those countries, but it's so dangerous, right? And so we always need to wonder about how our projects can affect someone's safety. As Rachel mentioned, I really work on projects that provide funding and wages for monitors. So with Big Stone Cree, one of our projects is paid for a good living wage, a professional wage for a person to be the environmental monitor that helps us set up all the work in the community, rather than what the grant allowed for was paying consultants to do the work. So, you know, like I again, in the oil sands region, I see where people and scientists make a lot of money with like master's degrees, doing environmental monitoring. So I really think we need equity in pay in that regard. And furthermore, if a community is doing citizen science, let's find ways to make that science affordable. The lab work is so expensive. We do some work with purple air monitors and developing other kinds of like testing kits for communities to use on the ground. And so I'll leave it there. I know I'm up on time, so thanks.
Thank you so much, Janelle. Great. I just wanted to say on your final point on finding ways to make it affordable and using low-tech solutions, we are going to have another session. The second session of this 4-part series is on emerging technologies and their use in community-based conservation. And that is taking place next Friday, the 7th of June at 2 p.m. Central European time. And we'll be advertising that shortly. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Yolanda. Hi, Yolanda, please introduce yourself and go forward.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Can we entertain a question or two now while we sort this out?
Yeah. Let's do it. Does anyone have a question for Janelle or Rachel? Juan, please.
Hi, how are you? Juan David Reina from Colombia. A question for both you, the presentation. And first, thank you for all presentation. There is other ways to communicate those results or methodologies beyond academic papers. I don't know, I am thinking about fanzines or guides or something like that in the local languages, because normally like we as academics try to push those results to the communication to wide population worldwide of academics, like through journals. But maybe, I don't know if you have experimental or experience other ways to communicate those processes and results in other means, in other ways. Thank you.
I'm happy to go first, Janelle. I don't see you anyway, but absolutely. When I saw Yolanda's presentation just came through. But ways that again, the publications that I shared are for the methodology of how to develop indicators and develop monitoring approaches for measuring what's important for communities. But communities that I've worked with have developed, for example, posters, which people in Fiji at least love to have posters in their community halls, which spur a lot of discussion during community meetings or gatherings, and making them really colorful with lots of photos. Another approach I know that's been used by collaborators has been development of cookbooks, for example, which showcase culturally important foods, right? And the knowledge and stories that are associated with them. So that's another kind of product of some of this work. But also I really, like you mentioned, academic publications are just one way. And I really do often question how much actually needs to be collected in these quantitative ways and how much is already, as Janelle mentioned, being discussed and monitored, and how can those methods and approaches that have traditionally been used be elevated. And just one more approach I know that's been used by some communities, and this is up to the community how much they want to share, right? But some communities have shared on social media, for example, different observations or changes to their land and seascapes through photos and stories that way. So thanks, Juan. I see a question from Mo in the meantime, if you want me to.
Please.
Yeah. Thanks, Mo, for your question. Very, very good concern. So the question is, you mentioned ways of compensating community for use of local knowledge. And I just want to specify, it's not necessarily compensating for the use of local knowledge, but for monitoring, which could involve local knowledge. Where can we draw the lines in terms of compensating and ensuring community doesn't wait for money incentives until they share knowledge that will help communities and the environment? Super great question. In my experience, I've dealt with this a couple ways. One is looking at precedents for how other organizations deal with payments to community and not necessarily paying a lot more, or of course not a lot less, but it's what I was referring to is not necessarily compensating people for their knowledge, but it's compensating for people for doing the monitoring, right? So if communities are expected to be reporting on changes to their systems, and they're expected to do either surveys or host conversations or what have you, they should be compensated for the time that goes into that. And so one way to do this as well is to compensate the community organizations and not necessarily individuals. So that's another way to do it, I think. And happy if others have. Yolanda, if you have a.
Thank you. We've sorted out the technology glitch. Thank you so much for your questions. And I am now going to share my screen and start the slideshow, except everything is okay. Yolanda, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. And, these things happen during those times. So that's why it's important to keep, to not allow the stress to fulfill our our minds. So thank you very much again for the invitation, and also for creating this space and to share some community practices. Today I will speak about indigenous peoples' Earth observations, advancing knowledge for environmental monitoring, and I decided to also bring some myths and frequent misconceptions about indigenous knowledge and doing environmental monitoring with communities. Next slide, please. So first of all, I would like to introduce briefly and to talk about myself. So I'm essentially a scientist working on different aspects of nature conservation. I'm using and applying social methods from the social and natural sciences, but I'm always trying to bring the indigenous scientific thought. I have been PhD student at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich in Germany. I have collaborated with different research institutions and organizations, but also I would like to mention that I have been doing a lot of work in relation to how to better include the knowledge of indigenous peoples into those global spheres which are of relevance for them. So I've been collaborating also and doing some work on that regard. So essentially my work is to create spaces for dialogue, to negotiate between those two different spheres that sometimes we might think that they overlap, but sometimes they don't. So essentially this is something about me that I really wanted to mention. Next slide, please. So why is important to understand that observing our beautiful planet is of relevance not only for indigenous peoples but also for the scientific community and the wider humanity, is because we all live and we all shape this planet, and is the interest of all of us to observe and to understand the changes and behavior, also to understand natural phenomena, and in a way that not only science can do. So it's important to continue observations and monitoring. So we will be able, with this information, to create solutions, to gather more knowledge, to face the current environmental challenges we all are facing. And this is important as well because complex problems on this planet are not going to be solved by single disciplines or by single approaches, and especially not won't be solved using only one knowledge system. Next slide, please. So there are different knowledge systems that we can, explore to try to understand this planet and how nature works. And one knowledge system that we can try to integrate and to really bring into this aspect is the knowledge of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples, they have a unique perspective of the functioning of the natural world, and they have been observing the planet, and this information can be seen as a rich data sets and documentation with a high level of detail that is usually not included in global Earth observations. So for example, the information that indigenous peoples can obtain at local or in situ is fundamental for understanding complex processes, but also can support global environmental observation tools. Next slide, please. So we all know that indigenous peoples are spread all around the world, and they manage over a quarter of the world land surface, and protecting more than 80% of the most important biodiversity areas of the world. They represent less than 6% of the world population. And one important aspect is that indigenous peoples, they confer a spiritual connection to nature. So essentially, nature has a cultural and spiritual value. And these spiritual values, combined with the precise and accurate knowledge of indigenous peoples about the natural world, is of relevance for understanding such complex problems. Next slide, please. So indigenous peoples, as I mentioned before, were among the first to observe and understand the planet. and they were able to notice changes in natural phenomena and to gain critical knowledge to adapt to environmental and climate changes. And this information, as I also mentioned, support new global technologies. Next slide, please. However, there are some interest on the bringing other knowledge systems together, not only indigenous knowledge, because scientists, they now want to understand better what is happening in this planet. And some scientists, they say, okay, we need to gather information from indigenous communities and bring it together to our own knowledge system. This, it's very good, but I think the approach is not the best. And this is because the majority of the times, research involving indigenous peoples has been defined and carried out primarily by non-indigenous researchers that often use approaches that do not reflect indigenous worldviews or perspectives, and sometimes this also do not benefit indigenous peoples and local communities as well. Next slide, please. So I will give you an example, a very precise example. Co-production of knowledge is a widely recognized term in nature conservation, and essentially is to gather the information produced by non-indigenous scientists and to combine it with indigenous knowledge. And as I said before, this is a good idea, but probably this is not the best approach. It's good because as I mentioned before, it's important to combine different knowledge systems together to better understand what are the problems our planet is currently facing. And the majority of the times, this process is rooted in an inclusive participation. However, this co-production of knowledge processes sometimes compromise justice due to power imbalances between researchers and communities. And some harms resulting from this might include misappropriation of stories, devaluation of indigenous knowledge, and data sharing problems. Next slide, please. When I said inclusive participation, is because indigenous peoples are often involved in scientific and political spheres, often to learn and to process concepts, approaches, ways of thinking, and engaging with Western ways. And this is not bad, but perhaps these do not lead to construct new knowledge at its maximum potential. And this is because the instruments and tools used for co-produce such knowledge come from colonizing methodologies and approaches that do not reflect indigenous perspectives. Next slide, please. So an indigenous point of view is, which is my point of view, of course, is that emphasizing processes in which we try to integrate indigenous knowledge rather than recovering or using methods and approaches that comes from indigenous understandings severely affect indigenous ways of thinking. Essentially, to achieve proper and fair monitoring require more than simply incorporating indigenous perspective. For a proper monitoring and for a fair monitoring, we need monitoring should be informed by indigenous intellectual tradition. And this is because more erosion of indigenous knowledge represents an existential threat to humanity. Next slide, please. So I would like to bring here, this is just one example, but I want to bring here some aspects that scientists should consider when working alongside indigenous communities. And I will present some myths and frequent misconceptions they have about indigenous knowledge. I'm gonna go through this like very quickly because of time, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask them during the discussion session. So one of the myths that I have been listening through all my career is that indigenous knowledge is similar to other knowledge systems, could be Western or technical, etc. This is not true, because indigenous peoples confer prominence as superiority to the natural world in people's relationship with nature. And this has always been present in the mindset of many indigenous groups worldwide through other perspectives, such as the right living in balance, and harmony with nature. So essentially, how nature is perceived is totally different from other paradigms. Next slide, please. And one example is the Andean knowledge or AILU system, in which this is a philosophy of living in which indigenous worldviews, the concepts rest on understandings of an harmonious humanity's relationship with nature. This constitutes the summa causa for many Andean communities. Next slide, please. Another myth is that indigenous knowledge of the past is not the same as the knowledge of today. This is not true, because all indigenous groups have in-depth knowledge of the natural and cultural environment that is place-based, specific, and associated with human usage, stretching back over many generations. They have been successfully managing landscapes for centuries and continue to do so. So essentially, because knowledge is transmitted orally, main characteristics remain, but as societies, indigenous groups have also evolved. Next slide, please. Another myth is that indigenous knowledge is not important in political and scientific spheres. This is not true, because, as mentioned as well previously, both spheres are pursuing collaborations with indigenous peoples, exploring how their knowledge can complement scientific endeavors. And current global frameworks, SDGs, and all of the frameworks that we know have recognized that indigenous knowledge are very important in nature conservation, and they are considered the stewards of the planet. Next slide, please. Another myth is that indigenous knowledge is imprecise and difficult to understand. I presented and give some examples that indigenous peoples have been able to accurately make measurements, observations, and predictions of natural phenomena. Many of them have not even occurred today, such as equinoxes, solstice, and they did so without the technology we have today. So it's very accurate and very precise and very complex. Next slide, please. And I have an example here. For example, I'm from a Mayan community, so the Mayas were very good at observing the behavior of the seasons, variation in trajectories of the sun, the stars. They managed to record and construct astronomical temples dedicated to different gods. And for this, they require deep knowledge, not only of the environment, but also mathematics, geometry, etc. So for example, I'm presenting here, this is in Spanish, but it's just to, an example of the Maya calendar for weather forecast and prediction, which involves a profound observation of nature. Next slide, please. Another myth is that indigenous knowledge must be combined with Western science. As also presented on previous slide, this is a commonly accepted idea, but this can lead to serious erosion of knowledge, particularly in groups that have lost important amount of knowledge and languages. So it's essentially good to work alongside indigenous communities, but it's important to recover and restore and revitalize indigenous knowledge first. Next slide, please. I have the example of the two-eye seeing, which embraces learning to see from one eye with the strengths of indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. This is one example of a different framework that can also be used for scientific inquiry. Next slide, please. Another myth is that indigenous knowledge is intangible. Indigenous knowledge works different interrelated levels of analysis from local to global, and the local representation is important. And the global is where scientists sometimes, they do not make sense because of the worldviews and all these on intangible knowledge. But I think a combination from local to global is crucial, and modeling tools can also include all of them. Next slide, please. So I have more myths and misconceptions, but I will stop here with some final remarks. The first one is that earth science or understanding earth systems must include indigenous knowledge and indigenous understandings of the environment into the measuring and monitoring processes. Also including indigenous knowledge and working or bridging all indigenous knowledge with other knowledge systems in environmental and biodiversity monitoring will significantly improve the representation and inclusion of locally based natural processes into global models. However, the methods and frameworks should be informed by indigenous intellectual traditions first. And finally, a real transformation will be possible if we restore, revitalize, and recover indigenous knowledge, and we work together to preserve indigenous ways of thinking. That's all from my side. Thank you very much, and apologies for the technological issues.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, and thank you again, Rachel and Janelle. I'd like to open the floor to questions. So please go ahead, go forth. Otherwise, I have questions too. So, but I'll let our participants first go. Okay, maybe I'll ask one of mine. What I'd like to ask you all is, what are your experiences in when you speak to the world of science, quote unquote, about your work with indigenous-led monitoring? Do you see more space opening up for these different ontologies and epistemologies to be part of scientific research and practice? I heard you say, Yolanda, that it's happening, but it's happening in quite a restricted way, and usually it's I can't remember exactly how you said it, but we have to integrate rather than bringing in indigenous science and intellectual traditions on their own. But what in general is your experience of bringing this to the scientific space?
Maybe I can start an example. When I was doing my PhD, I'm myself a Maya woman, and the Mayas were a water-oriented society. So my PhD was about hydrological topics, hydrological modeling. And for me, talking about how the Mayas ascribe meaning to water resources was important from a personal perspective. And when I asked in my to my supervisor if I can add a little bit of that particular question, how people ascribe meaning to water resources in the area, how the Mayas consider or why water is sacred in Yucatan, etc., then I was not allowed to do so because this was a hydrological PhD, and many hydrologists will think that I'm an esoteric or something like this, something that. So it was very difficult for me. So over the years now, I have understand more and learn more that it is possible to include, but of course, sometimes indigenous scholars can face a lot of challenges in trying to bring from a scientific perspective these specific aspects of nature conservation. So it was difficult.
Thanks, Yolanda. Janelle and Rachel, would you like to answer the question?
Sure. I have like various stories like Yolanda as well, but one that comes to mind is on the Berry project that I mentioned. Some of that funding through that organization came from the larger government networks of oil sands monitoring funding. And they used to have these really large meetings where it was like hundreds of scientists doing oil sands monitoring, and I was like the one social scientist invited, and it made them really nervous. And so at first I was like a poster in the corner, and then over time I was allowed to speak with elders, and but yeah, like it was just like, we don't know where to put you and this makes us uncomfortable. But it really depends on the society and the work, and I think a lot about, like Yolanda mentioned, kind of what I might frame as spiritual to avoid actually talking about, say, creatures. That's something that comes up a lot for me is creatures that community members are concerned about that aren't recognized by science, and the kind of conflict that can create, whereas scientists will just say to the community members, well, that's not real, so we're not monitoring it. And so then communities become really insular and don't want to work with the monitoring programs. So yeah, and so I think we have to maybe be sort of clever about ways of presenting it. And I think this is maybe a space where the academic publishing comes in handy, because the more we can write about the validity of these knowledge systems, the more we can, if it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, the more we can hold that space in meetings and negotiations and that sort of thing.
Thanks, Janelle. Rachel, do you want to contribute?
Sure, I can speak. I know every place is different and every context is different, but I almost feel like we're at a point where there's been too many failures of conservation, and there's been too many projects that have just not worked because they haven't been indigenous-led, or they haven't passed that power over. So it may be more in my region, but I think those failures are stacking up high, and I have to say that there has been a lot of, or not a lot, but there is a transfer of power that is occurring, and scientists do respect and attribute value to indigenous-led monitoring in Hawaii, starting to. It's not a complete picture yet, but I think a way that I think of myself contributing as a non-Indigenous person is really supporting and elevating the knowledge of students in the university setting. I think in order for this space to really change, academia has to change. And people in my position, for example, should be Indigenous people, especially Indigenous places, right? So I think that's a way that that science can, over time, it's overdue, be more supportive of Indigenous-led monitoring. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Rachel. So Shandin, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right. You have a question in the chat. Would you like to ask it? Maybe I'll ask it for the person. Is there data, brackets, not yet assimilated to knowledge, that are unique to Indigenous people that is not accessible to those outside a community? I guess this is for everyone.
Maybe I can say that this will really depend on the indigenous group. There are groups that, or there is some knowledge that some groups might think that is possible to share. There are other groups that there is some knowledge that is just totally knowledge that belongs to the community. So it really, from my perspective, depends on which group we are talking about.
Yeah, I agree. There's actually some knowledge that's just meant for certain places. And like, we really have to be okay with that, that there's systems of ways of sharing knowledge or gaining rights to access to knowledge that is not for public use, right? And I think, again, if we're an outsider, the best thing we can do is help support the community members in those systems, and help them have space and resources to continue with those important systems as well. And accept and be humble about it.
And maybe just I see a follow-up question by Shandin. So is there a logic that's unique to Indigenous peoples? And I would say yes, that Western science is, we gather data mostly by seeing and observing, and that's one way of knowing. And Indigenous peoples, again, every context is different, but use all senses to gather data and to know. So I think there is a difference.
Thanks, Rachel.
Very briefly, and with apologies, this is Susanna McCandless with GDF. I'll need to leave to pick up my daughter. But there's a wonderful example some time ago now, in the Clapmuck people in Western Turtle Island, known as British Columbia, learning GIS in order to map sacred space, but they mapped it in a way, they said, everything over here is sacred, and we're not going to tell you why. So that's a way of both making the sacred and making indigenous knowledge visible, and also keeping it within the community. And it was a lot of work.
Thanks, Susanna. Christian, where are you? Christian, there you are. Christian,
Hello,
there you are.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Emily. I'm Christian from Cameroon. I think I appreciate the presentation by Yolanda. I am grateful to be here to have listened to its presentation, and somebody having some experience from the field with indigenous people. I really tend to agree with her presentation that indigenous knowledge is necessary to have a blend with that with Western science. But I wanted to also, I don't know whether I'll share it like a question or a contribution, because my little experience is also showing me that I was turning to be afraid that indigenous knowledge may be gradually losing its place due to Westernization. This concept of Western development coming in particularly to Africa is because one of the obstacles we have with conservation is also with the indigenous people, because when the indigenous people tend to not understand the sustainable management of the resources they have, I think that embracing Western development in a very high rate will now tend to degrade the environment where they live. So when you meet indigenous people, you are talking about conservation, the challenge you get is that they need to develop and they are using the resources that is theirs. So the problem that we used to have is now the rate at which they are using these resources is degrading. What knowledge can they share to safeguard it? The questions always comes up like, okay, we need to do this, we need to also do this, we need to also do this, we need to survive. And the population is also growing, so they are encroaching. And gradually they are abandoning their conservation knowledge. And those are the things I used to think that maybe gradually the indigenous knowledge could be disappearing. I agree with the fact that we really need to blend it. And also with some little experience that I have is that when you come into a community and you are not an indigenous person from that community, it is also difficult to get the people understand with you. And when you use a local person from that community, at times it facilitates your work to pass your knowledge or for the research you get. Another contribution is also on the fact that most of the times we tend to express our findings from indigenous community through scientific publications, which at the end don't have an impact on the indigenous community because most of them don't access those scientific publications. So it is necessary to also have alternative ways of passing this information back to the indigenous people in a way that they can digest it and also incorporate it in their way of living. And I agree with what Susanna just lastly said, because we have this experience where in an area where we used to have elephants have gradually disappeared, but the indigenous people will tell us they have the elephants in their secret places in the forest. So if you want to see them, we cannot show you. And those are aspects of clear indigenous knowledge that is available, and they need to have that trust and confidence in you before they can share such knowledge. And those things, to me, it is also necessary. But on one part, I'm afraid that the knowledge may be disappearing based on embracement of Western development concepts, and on the other part, a few persons are still having the knowledge, and we need to really bring this out and put it forward. I think those are my contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. Would you like to answer, Yolanda, Janelle? Rachel?
Just to thank for the nice examples from Cameroon, and also to clarify that sometimes also when we are talking about indigenous knowledge or knowledge per se, we tend to forget that knowledge can be seen as the result of what we have been knowing, but also the process of knowing. And for nature conservation, both are important, but I think specifically for this session, I think the knowledge of the environment, the knowledge of the natural systems is relevant. And I think this is what I wanted to present. So it's not a conflict between two different paradigms, but it's more about the importance of preserving the knowledge for understanding nature, and how, because indigenous peoples, we have been facing a lot of erosion of our knowledge because historical processes, and it's important to stop such erosion and to start to recover. Is but I thank all the questions and the feedback from the participants from Cameroon. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda. We have still quite a few questions. There's a very lively chat going on. Thank you, Janelle, for answering questions in the chat. That's great. Asim, please go ahead.
Thank you, Emily. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So first off, thanks a lot to Rachel, Janelle, and Yolanda for such excellent presentations. I had a couple of questions for Rachel really quickly. So from what I gathered from your presentation, you were working with community developed well-being indicators, and I was wondering, you touched a little bit upon this already, but how did you account for, or have you in your work accounted for community biases, or let's call them intricacies within the community fabric when you're developing these indicators? And just to explain further, so I've worked with coastal fishing communities, which were deeply patriarchal, but notions of well-being from a male gaze or a male perspective, or from a majority perspective, would be very different from that of, let's say, well-being from a female perspective or a female gaze. How did you ensure that these indicators were equitable and representative of the community as a whole? That's my first question.
Great question, and that's something that's definitely on my mind a lot as well, because communities, not only are they not homogenous, but like you said, different interests lie in different groups, and people don't always feel comfortable, or if it's not always culturally acceptable to speak up in large groups, right? And so one method that we use in these types of workshops is either doing these exercises in subsets of the community, for example, with women's group, with youth group, and so forth, and really working in small groups where people aren't asked to speak up in front of everybody, and using tools where people can input their thoughts without attribution necessarily. And just to clarify, what we've developed is this framework, right? And we don't expect this framework to be relevant, every single factor within each dimension to be to fit with every single community. So it's really kind of a method that can be used elsewhere in a framework, which can be hopefully useful for communities as almost like a menu, right? Here's a menu of indicators that have been shared as being important for this region, and I think they're somewhat applicable to other regions as well. What from this menu is important to you, and how can we develop indicators that are context appropriate from this menu? So I hope that answers your first question.
That does. Thanks, Rachel. And my second question is also to you. And sorry, I realized I didn't introduce myself, but I'm Asim Sanyal. I'm from India, and I live and work on a really small island called Principe within the island nation of Sao Tome and Principe in the Gulf of Guinea off the western coast of the African continent. My second question, I think it's related a little bit to what Christian spoke about earlier about the loss of indigenous knowledge. So here on Principe Island, I've been working with traditional healers. There's like a traditional healers association, and they use a lot of medicinal plants for treating various ailments and afflictions. But there's been a gradual loss of interest in traditional wisdom among the younger generations. And I was just very curious if you in your work have encountered generational differences in perceptions of well-being, because I find that very fascinating because, for instance, based on anecdotal evidence with the communities that I work with here on the island, the younger generations are more keen to sort of eschew traditional wisdom in favor of modern medicine. They also have aspirations in terms of leaving the island, immigrating to Portugal, looking for better jobs, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I was just curious if you found those generational differences in your work.
Yeah, so a couple of things come to mind. One is in our framework, something that's come up as important for well-being is intergenerational transfer of knowledge. And because of that, we had developed indicators of not necessarily, well, both of how much knowledge is being passed down and are there spaces that that knowledge transmission can occur, but also measuring kind of people's perceptions of the importance of that. And I think there's definitely generational differences. So older generations have said that, passing down knowledge is very important. In my work, I found that kind of maybe middle-aged parents of maybe not quite middle-aged, but parents of young children actually in some communities have been shifted to saying that knowledge isn't as important anymore, and it's important to send their children to school to get an education which is not based on traditional knowledge. So we are seeing a shift in some places, and the whole purpose of indigenous-led monitoring, right, is if that's important for a community's well-being, then the community should be able to see that change in people's perceptions of that knowledge, and if they desire to do so, to act upon that. And one way that in my work, really quickly, how we've been doing that is in this work of developing indicators and thinking of ways to monitor, not document or capture traditional knowledge, but just to kind of monitor the status of it, whether it exists or not. We asked people, how do you want this work reported back to you? And I know nobody wants a copy of a journal article in the villages that I work, but we were asked if we could develop tools that can prompt those stories and intergenerational knowledge transfer. So we created a children's book actually with a local artist in Fiji, and it doesn't include any traditional knowledge, but it kind of has some prompting questions and illustrations with local species of plants and animals that encourages younger generations to ask their older generations questions about traditional knowledge without encoding any of that in the book itself. So that's one way. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much,
Rachel.
Thanks, Asim and Rachel. We have only a few minutes left, so I'd love to give Aldo his opportunity. Aldo, can you stay with us for a few minutes? There we go.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? I think this question is a little bit connected with the one that Asim made, but when all the organizations or researchers sometimes work with indigenous knowledge, they present the results as divided, the territorial or economical, cultural, and a lot of times when we work with indigenous people and with their traditional indigenous knowledge, it's more holistic, the view of the territorial, the natural. So I'm asking this because I don't know how are the efforts or the advances in a way that are doing the academic, in showing those holistic visions of the cultural or the indigenous people, and not to show some part, you know. I don't know if I'm explaining it right, but it's like, okay, this is like the river and the water, and from our indicators has only one meaning and represent this. But when you ask some elder or someone that has a knowledge of their territory, it's more than that. And how are the academic? This question is for the three of you that are working, that are researching, to trying to advance in that way, that results, that I don't know, that investigations, trying to I don't know, that decolonize a little bit the mythologies, to show those exact visions of the people that you are working with. Thanks.
Rachel, Yolanda, Janelle, do you have answers? Did you understand the question? So my understanding of the question, Aldo, and let me correct me if I'm wrong, is how do you ensure that indigenous knowledge is holistic and encompasses everything? How do you ensure that that you're not just extracting one component of it, one little aspect that doesn't and removing the tethering that has to the broader web of life and the cosmology?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. I think that I realize it's a little bit too much, but sorry, but that's the thing. Yeah.
I would say that I think this is the problem, isn't it? And like our existential problem. And so this is why I would argue, like, if a community wants to do a project, like, their direction and design and concerns come first, because then it comes with that entire system, right? And then there's like little tools that we use in our toolbox to help support certain projects or negotiations or things that they're trying to demonstrate. But again, to me, like, you know, we're facing such dire times, and I think we're all here because we all know that communities who are still connected to their lifeways understand the greater web of life and human coexistence, right, on the planet. And so to me, I think that's where we need to all kind of, again, be humble and start from, as opposed to just trying to piece out or extract certain parts of knowledge that fit our, you know, our purposes, for whatever they are in research or monitoring or whatever it is. I hope that's helpful.
And I'd like to say, Aldo, that we are going to be talking about this in the 4th session of the series, where we'll be talking about actually rooting conservation in indigenous ontologies and how that's been done in different places. So hold out. There is an actual whole session on that topic. And I'm aware that we're over time, but we have had and there are a few questions we might have missed, but I think I'm going to call it a day so that everyone can get on with their day. And thank you so much to the speakers, and thank you everyone who's joined us. It's been a fantastic session, and the next session is on emerging technologies and the opportunities and challenges of these in the context of community-based conservation. That's on Friday the 7th at 2 p.m. Central European time. Okay. Oh, and Janelle has just answered the cultural keystone species question, so quickly check the chat before you go. So thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day, have a lovely evening, and see you soon.